Good afternoon and welcome to the Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name is Eileen Burke and I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. Our lecture today is sponsored by the Preservation Association of Lincoln. If you're interested in these programs, please join our membership. You can join by going to preservelincoln.org. Our speaker today is Jeff Korbelik. Jeff is the author of Lost Restaurants of Lincoln. He is the former Lincoln Journal-Star feature editor and currently is the manager at James Arthur Vineyards in Raymond. He continues to write restaurant reviews for the Journal-Star Ground Zero Entertainment magazine, which he's done since 1998. Jeff's talk today it's also the title of his book, Lost Restaurants of Lincoln, and this is part 2. We filmed part 1 in January of 2019, and you can find that one on YouTube. Please join me in welcoming Jeff Korbelik.
Thanks, Eileen. Appreciate that. As she mentioned, I did a talk in January, so this is part 2, so I'm going to kind of focus on some of the restaurants I didn't focus on the first time, but also revisit a couple of others. Our first time we did this, about a third of the way through, the screen mysteriously started going up. Yeah, so it was kind of spooky. And then I thought that we have a ghost at the winery, and I kind of thought that the ghost might have followed me out here to mess with me. The ghost's name is Charlie. He used to own the property where James Arthur Vineyards is, just outside of Raymond, and he died tragically in a train accident, but he's still hanging around. He's kind of a flirt. None of the male employees have ever seen Charlie, but the female employees have had experiences with him, and he does things like mess with the lights and mess with the music and stuff like that. So owner Jim Ballard, and he's also the winemaker, created a wine. It's called Aura, A-U-R-A, and that's named for Charlie. Aura is like Spectre, that kind of thing. So it's a white port, tastes very good, it's fortified with brandy, so if you come on out, I'll give you a taste of that. So when the screen went up, I was like, oh darn, here's my first Charlie experience, and I'm not even at the winery. So thanks for coming on out. I'm battling a cold, so excuse my voice. Last week I ran the half marathon, and then I gave blood 2 days after. I got my 10-gallon pin. I'm very thrilled about that. And then I got a cold. So I have now deduced, do not run a half marathon and give blood, because then it kind of weakens your immune system. So the book came out in December, early December, and it was about 6 months after I had to have it done, and that was about 6 months after I signed my name on the contract. The story is, well, I'll give you a little bit of background, who I am personally. I grew up here in Lincoln. I was born and raised here. My dad is retired State Patrol. He was a captain of Troop C in Grand Island when he retired. And so we moved around quite a bit. So I lived in Beatrice for a number of years too, from 73 to 79. We came back to Lincoln when my dad was promoted to lieutenant, and I graduated from Lincoln Southeast, 1982, and then attended the University of Nebraska and majored in journalism and English, and then had a minor in history, so I've always been kind of a history buff. One of my favorite professors was Dr. Benjamin Rader, who some of you may know. He taught a history of sport class, and I was a huge sports nut, and if I had my way, I would have been a starting pitcher for the New York Mets. But my 70-mile-per-hour fastball seemed to leave the yard a lot. So since I wasn't that great of an athlete, I went to the next best thing and started writing about athletes. And so when I graduated, I first worked at the Bellevue Leader, a weekly newspaper outside of Omaha. Spent a year there, and then moved to Grand Island, and became a sports writer and then the sports editor there. And my goal was to cover a national championship, and I got to do it 3 times. So 4 if you count the volleyball team, when Terry Pettit won his first one. So that was very exciting for me. And then I had an opportunity to return and work for my hometown newspaper. I grew up reading the Lincoln Journal. We had a subscription to the Journal. And I was a big fan of the sports writers like Ken Hamilton, who's now a close friend, Randy York, Chuck Sinclair, Mike Babcock, who's a good friend too. I grew up reading these guys, and then I had an opportunity to work with a few of them, and so I was very excited. So in '96, I moved back, worked in the sports department. 2 years later, in '98, we launched a entertainment magazine called Ground Zero. Still around today. We had a big 20th anniversary celebration last year for it. About that time, I decided sports was enough. Working, the weekends and the nights were kind of burdensome. So I had an opportunity to join the feature staff, and it was just at the time we launched the magazine. And the magazine focuses, if you guys are familiar with Ground Zero, it focuses on movies, which El Kent Wolgamott does all the movie reviews. Performing arts, which is what I wrote. I covered the symphony and stuff happening at the Lead Center and the Playhouse Theater and that kind of thing. Popular music, which Kent covered. That was live music happening at the bars. And then the one thing we just sort of just added a restaurant feature. We would write a restaurant review. Back in the day, the Star, not so much the Journal, but the Journal did do some after the Star did it. They would do restaurant reviews periodically, and they weren't. It's interesting. I mean, they did it, and what I found since I started doing this in '98 is it's really taken off, the whole food thing, and you can tell by there's a good crowd here. And my first talk was standing room only. It was wild. Is that people have a passion for food, and you've really noticed this on television. The Food Network came about in the late 90s, somewhere right, maybe even the late 80s. Some of those shows, Emeril Lagasse became like the first, became the first, one of the first popular chefs. Today you got, Gordon Ramsay and Bobby Flay, and you have all these people, that are doing these shows. You got Top Chef, and people are just really tuned in to food. They love their food, and they love to talk about food. And we noticed when we started doing Ground Zero that every week when we started, and this more recently, it's all about getting hits on the website now. Anytime I would write a restaurant review, it would always be the #1 story for the week. Yeah, because people would want to read about the new restaurant that came to town. So it was very exciting. So what started out as just kind of a throw-off idea to add to round out the Ground Zero section has really evolved into one of the main things that Ground Zero does now. The dining reviews. So how did I become a restaurant reviewer? Well, I was a sports writer, and I really didn't cook. I don't have a culinary background. What happened was my boss at the time, the late Linda Olig, asked me if I would do the first restaurant review, and I said, sure, yeah. I had never really reviewed a restaurant, but I'd give it a go, and it was Cracker Barrel. Yeah, Cracker Barrel, which is now, that was 1998, so it's been going strong for 21 years. It's still alive. What I find is some of those chain restaurants, like Cracker Barrel or Cheddar's, they succeed because they give you a lot of food for a good price. So yeah, so I think they have a good secret, not so much a secret, but that's how they've succeeded in Lincoln. So yeah, so I wrote that. I took two of my coworkers. Mark Darowich was a sports writer, and Art Hovey was the editorial page editor at the time, and they were my first two dining companions. And so we went and did Cracker Barrel, and the way I used to write the reviews was it was more a feature about the restaurant. I was saying, okay, here's the restaurant, here's who owns it, and here's the menu, and this is what you think. After about 10 years of doing that, I found that people wanted more criticism, and this ties in with how the food show's taken off. And you see Gordon Ramsay, and you have the competitors in front of him, and he's just saying that is awful, and close the kitchen and all that stuff. So I found that people wanted a little more criticism. I used to have a box that attached to to the restaurant reviews. Well, I still have a box, but in the box I had like a rating system, and I would give it, stars. But then people were like, well, what does 3 stars really mean? They wanted more than that. So I sat down with 2 chefs that I respect. One of them is in the book, Maggie Pleshek. Maggie ran Maggie's Vegetarian Cafe for 18 years, successfully ran a vegetarian restaurant in a beef state, which is just incredible. Sat down with Maggie and Sean Carmichael, who is the owner of Shea Hay Catering. I sat down with them and I said, hey, I want to, try to add some criticism, make this more critical, and we bandied back and forth about how we would do this. And so then I settled on an idea. And today, this is how Ground Zero is set up. You'll read the restaurant review. You still get kind of the background, the intro, where you find out about who these people are. For instance, this week's dining review will be on the UNI Curry Bowl, which just opened a couple of months ago at where Samurai Sam's used to be. And the couple that opened it, Nazim and Asma Khan, Nazim is the head chef at Bryan Health. He came here a few years ago. And so, and his wife, they're both from Bangladesh originally, and they have a desire to, they had a desire to open up their own restaurant in addition to Nazim working in the healthcare industry. So there's the background part of it. And then what I next will go into and what I do is then kind of give a section on food, give a grading on what I ate and what I thought of it, the same on the atmosphere, the same on the service, and then the same on specialty diets, because everybody's concerned. A lot of people have allergies, gluten-free eating, that kind of heart healthy, that kind of thing. So that's where it was, and then I started doing that 10 years after that, and so I've been at it for 20-some years. So, and when I left the newspaper last year, they asked me if I'd continue writing the restaurant reviews, and my wife said yes, he will. Yes, because over the years, if you've read my restaurant reviews, I would have dining companions, and I mentioned Mark and Art were my first 2 dining companions. And so then I had all my friends who wanted to be my dining companions, And if you go back through the history, you'll see how my wife Rebecca went from girlfriend to fiance to wife. In fact, she started out as a dining companion, then girlfriend to fiance to wife. So she loves this part of the job because she doesn't have to write. She gets to eat and enjoy and go out to eat and have a thing. And I think again, the part of the restaurant, eating at a restaurant, is not so much about the food, but it's about the experience. And so when I get into this book here, I think people have memories that tie into this. It's you remember that, like your first date at a certain restaurant. I don't know how many people have. Tony and Luigi's is a part of a book, and how many folks have come up to tell me a story that was very personal to them, that related to an experience that happened to them at Tony and Luigi's. So I think that's part of the reason why restaurants have an appeal, and why this book has done pretty well for me. As I said, Arcadia Publishing, they have a branch called the History Press. They reached out and asked if I knew anybody that could write a history book about restaurants. Arcadia Publishing specializes in these memory books. They were recently featured in the Washington Post for the success they've had at doing these memory books around the country. They'll go to cities. There was one that came out around Christmas time in Denver about the department stores that were popular back in Denver in the day. There's a Lost Restaurants of Omaha book out, so you can find that and read about that one too. And so they find people to write these things. Our responsibilities as the authors is to do all the research and do all the interviewing and all the writing, and then also gather all the photos and stuff. And then they provide us editors and designers for the cover art and all that stuff. And then of course make contacts and set up these talks and things like that, and the publicity, that end of it. So they reached out. They said, "Hey, do you know anybody?" And I gave them a couple of names, and I said, one of them might be me. I have a little bit of a background, and they said, well, they came back and they said, yeah, that would be good if we could have you do it. And I said, well, I really don't have time. and I didn't. As a features editor, I was just swamped. If the newspaper business is always go, 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 go all the time. And so I told them no, and that was in May, and then they kept coming back to me, and they said, we'd really like you to do it. And then my wife urged me, and she goes, you should really do this. And I said, I don't know. And then Mr. McKee, Jim McKee, the local historian, I told him about it, and he sat me down. He said, Jeff, everybody has one book in them, and this is your opportunity to write a book. So, and he says you're about halfway done because you have the context and the experience, and some of the restaurants you want to write about, you've already written about. Yeah, so he says you're halfway there, and I said okay. So at the urging of Jim and my wife Rebecca, I signed the dotted line, and then I thought, well, that'd be great. They'll give me a couple of years to write a book. I can do this in my free time. And then they said, no, we need this in 6 months. So a lot of people ask why certain restaurants are in it. That's the main reason. I only had 6 months, and so I did as many as I could. There were others I did some preliminary research into, but I just couldn't find enough information, and I didn't have enough time to do more digging into the restaurants. But I have 30 plus restaurants in the book, and it's divided into two parts. It's restaurants and supper clubs, so it was the big places that people remember, like Tony and Luigi's on that end, and then on the other half is diners and cafes and drive-ins. And some of those are the biggies, like King's Food Host, for instance, which, those are the two must-haves that have to be. If you write about Lincoln Restaurant, you got to have King's because it was like one of the most successful local chains, and Tony and Luigi's because it was one of the most successful full-service restaurants in Lincoln, Nebraska. So I sit down, and then I just started. I started doing research. I went to city directories first. Went to the Journal Star, our old city directories, and started kind of writing down restaurants that were around. I started in 1900 and went ahead, and if they were still around in like 1910, then I would just kind of jot them down, and then I compiled this list, and I had like 100 or so restaurants after the list, and like I said, some of them jumped out, right away. And so then I, started going back, and then I went into the Journal Star files, and we have an old library. We used to clip stories and put them in envelopes back in the day. Kim would remember that. So if you had to do a research on something, and they started doing that probably in about the 40s or 50s, that area. And so anything beyond that, in the early part, I subscribed to a service called newspapers.com. And paid for that, and they have all the Lincoln journals and all the Lincoln Stars dated available online that you can look like at the original newspaper, so you just plug in, like the first slide that's coming up, the Greenwich Cafe, and it'll pop you to everything that's ever been written about the Greenwich Cafe. So that was very handy. So I was able to get some of that stuff that was before the 50s to do some of my research. The next big part of it, after I did my research, then I started doing interviews, and I did 20 plus interviews with people that are still around, that are connected to these restaurants. And for instance, Tony and Luigi's, I sat down with Mike Alicio, who's the son of the owner of Tony Alicio, and his cousin, Tony Massinio. Both of those fellas own Valentino's, the chain today. So I sat down in their corporate office there, and that was a treat. I'll talk about that a little later. But so I did, so I sat down, did a bunch of interviews. Then the next part was to go back and transcribe all this, because I taped everything, because I wanted to make sure I had everything correctly. Taped and transcribe all those interviews. And then I sat down and started writing. And I started writing probably at the beginning of December and didn't stop until I submitted everything in mid-February of 2018. So it was a process. And I would write all day at the Journal Star, and then I'd come home and sequester myself in my office and write all night. And it was fun. It was an interesting thing. And I learned a ton about these things that I didn't know. So you've heard enough of me blabbing on, so I'll kind of start showing you the photos and give you a little bit of background. So I mentioned this is one of the older restaurants that I wrote about. Some of you, we were talking earlier, we have this debate whether it's the Greenwich Cafe or the Greenwich Cafe. But it was named, Francis and Millie Weiler named it for Greenwich Village because Francis had a passion for New York City. And so the Greenwich Cafe was on O Street. Some of you folks may remember this. And when I wrote these, history books can be kind of boring because if they just give you the facts, it opened this day and it closed this day and they, introduced this menu on this date. What I tried to do with the book was tell stories. And that's what I am. I'm a storyteller for the Journal Star. And so the story behind this one was they were known for their fish and chips. And everybody went there for the fish and chips. And so the story behind that was that a botany professor, a Dr. John Doc Davidson. Do you remember Doc? No? Okay. He was a botany professor. I'm asking. My father-in-law is in the crowd, by the way. So, he wanted to do a party. He wanted to rent out the Greenwich Cafe for 60 of his colleagues and friends, and he was going to do the cooking. He had a recipe for fish, for fried fish, for Icelandic cod, and he said it was, so good that, people will love it. And so he did. He rented it out, and they raved about it. And so Millie said, hey, why don't you come try this at the restaurant? And so he started doing this on Friday and Saturday nights. He would come down and fry fish for him. And it became a very popular thing to do. They had, people waiting to get tables to eat Doc's fish. And so it became kind of a known for a fish and chips kind of place. It was also known for Millie. She was quite a character. And she ran the restaurant up until the mid '80s, and then she finally sold it. But it was a very popular place, and you can see on there it says fried chicken, beer, chili, fried oysters, kind of thing. So it was lots of fried food. So this is I have a series of older restaurants, and the oldest is probably the Acme Chili Grill. Which opened by a Greek immigrant, Mr. Christopoulos, and that was downtown. And probably the second oldest restaurant I have in the book would be the Yum Yum Hut. I remember that. Yeah, do you remember the Yum Yums? Yeah, they were called Yum Yums. Some people today like to call them Tasties. They're loose meat sandwiches. Lincoln, Nebraska loves their loose meat sandwiches because probably two of the most popular restaurants that existed was the Yum Yum Hut, which was on 29th and O Street, just a block off of O Street, and Tasties, which was over there on about 48th and Holdridge area. And so the Yum Yum Hut was so popular that on Saturday nights, the police had to come and direct traffic because there would be so many people. The cars would line up and they would line into O Street, and it would cause traffic problems, and so the police would have to come. And towards the end, it was operated by three sisters. They ran it until the mid-'60s. It opened in the mid-'30s, and so it was very successful. It ran for 30 years, and it made its living off of loose meat sandwiches. Would that be north of us? Yes, it was. Yep. I think the exact address was like 129 North 29th, something like that. Yeah. So so about 29th and O. So it was So it did very well. In the 60s, oh yeah.
At the Yum Yum Hut, did they have other food, or did they just have the Yum Yums?
No, they had. Her question was, did they have just the Yum Yums? But no, they had other kinds of sandwiches and fries and to go along, and shakes and drinks and that kind of thing. So, all right. In the mid 60s. Lincoln saw what was very popular was supper clubs, and of course, this was after World War II, and the veterans came back, and what they liked to do was to go out and eat and go to clubs and dancing. One of the most successful was, you had to be a veteran to attend this, but this is the American Legion Club. This is a photo of Bob Devaney, Coach Bob Devaney, and Bob Logsdon. Bob Logsdon was the longtime general manager at the Legion Club, and he was one of Bob's best friends. And in fact, he served as a pallbearer at Coach Devaney's funeral. and they were best friends. Back in the day, the Legion Club was the hub for anything Nebraska football because Coach Devaney and his assistants, after the game, would eat at the Legion Club, and they kind of had. I interviewed Bob's son, Rob. Bob has since passed away too, and I asked Rob, and I said, did they have like a special area? And he said, no, they just come in and they would, wherever what was open, they would sit down, and all the coaches would sit together, and they were very approachable. You could just go up and talk to Coach Devaney. You could say, hey, good game, and he would talk. He was just an ordinary Joe kind of guy, and he loved talking to the people. I don't think you would see that today. I don't think you'd see Coach Frost and his coaches gathering at a restaurant and then holding court like Coach Devaney did back in the day. So the Legion was very popular. It started downtown, and then they moved it out up around 56th and P.O. Streets areas, and then they moved to another place. So that's all in the book. But it was known. So you went there and ate, and then they would bring in these great dance bands. And in fact, Jay McShann, who was a noted jazz pianist from Kansas City, often came up and played at the Legion Club. And so. And Rob told me, he said it was loud, and people were just happy, and they were dancing, and it was just, that was how it was in the 60s and early 70s. So, all right, the lady on the right, does anybody recognize her? That is Alice Schroeder for Alice's Restaurant. Yeah, some of you folks remember Alice opened a restaurant. That's her son in the middle, and then his son's her daughter-in-law at the restaurant. They were looking at the one where they opened up on 70th Street, the second one. They're scoping things out there. She ran the restaurant down in College View, and the story behind that was on Sundays after church, the line went out the door. People loved Alice's Restaurant, and you sometimes would wait for an hour, to get a table. But that was the thing to do. You went to church, and then you went to Alice's. That was it. She had so much success at College View. She ended up opening 2 more restaurants. She had one on 70th Street, and then another for a short time on Cotner Boulevard. But Alice's was known for home style cooking. And pies. Those pies were good. She had a baker. Her name was last name was Opp, and in fact, Mrs. Opp she did pies later on for some of the restaurants around Lincoln, because I know I did a couple of stories, and those pies were good, weren't they? So yeah. So here we go. It's interesting how Lincoln's dining scene evolved, but this was one of the first buffets to open in Lincoln. This is the Bishop Buffet. My memory of Bishop Buffet is chocolate cream pie. When I went to Bishop Buffet, I always got a chocolate cream pie. So that was my favorite. So the buffet started downtown, and then they built this out by Gateway. Yeah, out by Gateway. Yeah, and was very successful and ran for a number of years. They had a big location in Omaha. But it introduced buffet eating to Lincoln, Nebraska. It was one of the first places to do so.
Where was it at first?
It was downtown. It's in the book. I'd have to look. Yeah, you'd have to look. I have the address in the book, but I have to. Yeah, my memory's not so good. So yes.
Lincoln hosted a chess tournament in 1955, and one of the grandmasters wrote that his experience in Lincoln was eating at the Bishop.
Oh, really? So yeah. He mentioned that there was a grandmaster chess champion that came, and he wrote about how one of his experiences was eating at Bishop Buffet. So, yeah. All right, this is Carmen and Art Longoria. They introduced Mexican food to Lincoln, Nebraska. They were the first Mexican restaurant. Arturo's was. It was actually, the first restaurant was called the Taco Hut. It was downtown on the infamous block 35. I say it infamous because if you remember, Block 35, the city decided that they wanted to develop that, and they wiped out that entire block. Do you remember this? Yeah. It's where Embassy Suites now sits now, and but there was some great restaurants that sat on that block. The Taco Hut, then later Arturo's, the Skylight Bistro, which is coming up here. Skylight Bistro. There was a place where I went to in the 80s. It was called McGuffey's. It was like a little jazz club that we would go there on Thursday nights to listen to UNL professors play jazz music. It was great. So the city wiped out this block, and then it sat as a parking lot forever. If you remember, it was just parking and they finally got around to developing it. It's a beautiful hotel there now. But yeah, so the Longorias, actually was Art's mother introduced Mexican food. The story behind that was nobody knew really what, this was in the early 60s, Lincolnites didn't really know what Mexican food was. And so in order to get people to come in through the door, what she was, with people who were working downtown at the time, she would bring them in by offering desserts, pie, that kind of thing. Hey, come on in, free pie, that kind of thing. Come in, have a cup of coffee, get a piece of pie. And then when she had that captive audience, she brought out the Mexican food from the kitchen and said, hey, what do you think of this? Try this, And people were like, wow, this is really good. So then they started coming back, bringing their friends and family to try the Mexican food. And then Arturo's became known for the tachas. Do you remember the tachas? Yes, it was a flat tortilla with refried beans. Basically, that's what it was, refried beans and either pork or cheese and, some jalapenos on top. And those tachas were a huge hit. And the recipe, Art and Carmen's sons, I sat down with Rennie and Daniel to interview them. And the whole family worked there. It was a family-owned restaurant, and a lot of these restaurants that are featured in the book were family restaurants, and so they shared the recipe for the tacha. It's not that hard to make, and that's part of the book too. I have a ton of recipes in here. So some of them that'll date back. The families, a lot of the families were very, very nice to donate them. Kay's Restaurant, for example, I have a couple of them from Kay's Restaurant, which was over in Piedmont, and a lot of folks remember Kay's back in the day. The Skylight Bistro was on the block 35. This restaurant, I added this restaurant. This was for my personal memory. So I mentioned that people have connections to restaurants, and for me, this was the first time I had duck ever. I had never had. I grew up in a family where it was steak and hamburger and chicken. In fact, when we used to butcher chickens, we'd eat the entire chicken, including the feet. Back in the day. So yeah, but my dad didn't hunt, so I never had duck. That kind of thing. So I had a fraternity formal, and I took the young lady, and we went to the Skylight Bistro, and I had duck. What was interesting about the Skylight Bistro was that it was one of the restaurants that the menu was a little different, and it wasn't the typical steak and potato kind of place. So they had some different kinds of foods, and so it was very popular. It was a fine dining experience if you remember, if you ever ate at the bistro. So I threw that slide in because again that was my personal one, and I wrote it. That was kind of like my chapter. So. The story behind this is those are the owners of Crane River. That is Christina and Linda. They opened Crane River they were the second brew pub. The first was Wayne sitting here, Laszlo's. Laszlo's was the first, a couple of years after Laszlo's opened. And Laszlo's is not in the book because they're still thriving and going strong. So yeah, Linda and Christina, they love to make their beer, but the only way you could share your beer back then was, and it's not like today, back then the only way you could serve it was you had to have a restaurant. They didn't really want to be in the restaurant business, but they really wanted to share their beer with the public, and they were beer makers. They were university professors, and they had a passion for making beer. So they opened up Crane River, When I was telling the story, they had a lot of good stories about this restaurant, but the big one was everybody kind of remembers that quilt. Remember that quilt that hung on the wall, and it was a huge quilt. And the quilt maker, her name was Shelley Berg. She made that for him, and it was just a gorgeous quilt. And so it was a big deal, and the paper made a big deal about it when they hung that quilt, and there were several stories about it. So I dove into the Crane River story, talking about the quilt. So I of course got a photo of the owners in front of the quilt, and to my surprise, at one of my first book signings, Shelley came up to me and said, that was my quilt. Yeah, and I signed her book, and I thanked her very much, and she was just thrilled that I had included that. And I said, well, you had to include it because people remembered that quilt. That was what you remembered about the Crane River experience. Also, Crane River, it's funny, when I was talking to Christina, when I interviewed her, she said, they made headlines around the country. They were featured in many national magazines. And it wasn't because of their beer, but it was because they were women. There were 2 women running a brew pub, which at the time was novel, I guess. Was unusual. And she said here in Lincoln, we didn't get that kind of treatment because everybody knew who we were. And they knew that we loved to make beer, so it wasn't that big a deal for the Lincoln folks. They were like, oh yeah, that's Linda and Christina's. Yeah, that's their beer. So yeah, so. All right, folks, you recognize the inside of that? That's Grandmother's. Yep, Grandmother's. That's the one up on 70th. Grandmother's, the first restaurant was over there on Sun Valley Boulevard. One of the co-owners was former Senator Bob Kerrey. So I sat down with the general manager, Matt Smith, and we had a talk about that, about how how Grandmother's was kind of the place to be there. It was very successful in the 90s, especially when they moved to open that second location over on 70th and A. And I still have people today say, I wish Grandmother's would come back. There's been a couple of other restaurants that have tried in that location, but have not succeeded. And yeah, and they were known. The recipe I have in here is for their French onion soup that Matt shared. But so they were known for, again, some of the home style fare, but soups. I think they did a fried chicken too. That was pretty good too. Yeah, that they would have it. So yeah, and so Grandmother's again was kind of a personal one for me that I had to have. All right. So we were talking about buffets earlier. That's the Noles. Yeah, when it was first, before it became very pretty out there. Yeah, the Noles Restaurant. When I was writing the book, I didn't want to. Most of the restaurants, it was like a lot. Everything was downtown, and it seemed. And when I did my research, that's where the restaurants were, because that's where the people were. It was downtown Lincoln. In fact, back in the day, the Yum Yum Hut was the edge of Lincoln, 29th and O. And then Tony and Luigi's was like out in the boondocks at 52nd and O. So when I wrote this, I wanted to, over the years, Lincoln became spread out more. So I wanted to make sure I included. So I wanted the Noles, which is over at 27th and Old Cheney. I wanted to include a restaurant from the Havelock area. People would think, well, Misty's. Well, Misty's is still going. It's not lost. It's still going. But there was another restaurant, cafe, that had ran for almost 30 years there. It was called Norma's Cafe. So I did a feature and sat down with the family and did a story about Norma's for the book. So I wanted to make sure I get the town covered, and the Noles was popular. The Busalis family ran this for a number of years, and it was known. It was a country club, but it was open to the public, and they had great buffets. They had a great buffet. They had a carving station that was just wonderful. So. All right, back. This is Papa John Casas and his wife Despina, and this is them photographed inside of their restaurant, which sat just south on 13th and O. It was Papa John's. if you remember right. And I wanted, Papa's story was interesting. He and his wife immigrated here from Greece. Actually, it was an island off of Greece, and they came over and they settled in Ohio. And he got into the restaurant business there, and then eventually got into the Bonanza family, and he opened a Bonanza in Lincoln, and it was the one over on 48th and Highway 2. When he left Bonanza, he signed a contract that said he would not open another restaurant that featured the same kind of foods that Bonanza had. Well, if you remember, Bonanza had a wide variety of stuff, so it was going to be very difficult. So he opened a Greek restaurant. He went to his heritage, and so he opened. And so here it was in downtown Lincoln, had a little Greek restaurant. Papa John, again, these were family-operated things, and all his kids worked at the restaurant. Well, two of his sons, George and Mike, went on to open their own restaurant, and today it's one of the most successful restaurants in Lincoln, and that's the Parthenon. Yeah, over there on 56th and Highway 2. So those kids got their start working in their dad's restaurant, and today they're running their own place. Tied into that, John's sister, Stella, there's Stella. Stella and her husband, Pete, in the blue shirt there, they took over Cool's restaurant. It's funny how this town is kind of small, where everybody kind of knows everybody, and that's the kind of thing. So the Hamadas family took over Cool's. Cool's already had a great reputation. In fact, Kurt and Pearl Cool are friends of my family. They're dear friends, and Kurt has passed away, but Pearl just celebrated her 90th birthday, and I sat down with Pearl and interviewed her with her two of her sons, and I grew up with Paul. Paul is now a co-owner of Dino's, so he stayed in the restaurant business. So Paul Cool is co-owner of Dino's, the sports bar up there on 84th and Van Dorn. So Cool's, they opened their first restaurant at 17th and Van Dorn, which is where the Normandy is now, the little French restaurant. And then they moved over to Rathbone Village, and they ran a restaurant there, which some people remember as the Red Rooster, and then, back in the day, today it's Stir 22, the African place. And then they came downtown and ran a couple of restaurants downtown where the Lincoln YMCA is now. They had a restaurant there, and then where the Graduate Hotel is, they ran a restaurant inside the hotel that was there too. So they did that, and then they opened up their own place on O Street. And today, you still, they were known for breakfast. I mean, you can see all the breakfast food that the Hamadas family, the Cool's, that's where you went. When you were downtown, you went to Cool's restaurant for breakfast, And even to this day, we still don't have a place that's known for breakfast in downtown Lincoln. The hotels all have their, breakfast kind of place, and the Egg and I is over there, but probably the closest would be the restaurant on over by the old Peel Piers. Over there. Did I say that again? Yeah, Green Gateau. Thank you. The Green Gateau is probably the one downtown restaurant. So, in fact, Green Gateau has great eggs Benedict, by the way. So the Hamadas family ran it for a little while, for a number of years. They ran it for almost as long as the Cools did. So and they became kind of, and they had regulars, that people came, and they were also known for their pies. They used to have this rack that sat right by the front door that was, This gentleman with that great mustache is Frank Harden. Frank Harden was a restaurateur who not only, this is him inside the Lincoln Exchange. He opened two restaurants in town that some folks may remember. He first opened the Lincoln Underground in 1976, and that was over 9th and Q Streets, which later became Brittany's. And it was the Lincoln Underground. It was down in the basement, and it was known because Frank had an eye for decor. He and his partners, really wanted to make it an experience. So so the atmosphere was what you went for. The same thing with the Lincoln Exchange. The Lincoln Exchange was probably one of the top fine dining restaurants back in the day, back in the 80s. The Exchange opened in 1980. It is where Francie and Fitch bookstore is now. And again, it was just a gorgeous restaurant and had a great menu. And some of the people that worked there went on to have great success. Probably the most notable would be Nader Farabad, who runs Billy's Restaurant. He worked at the Lincoln Exchange before he opened his own restaurant. And as you know, Billy's has been around for over 30 years now. And Nader he has very fond memories of his Lincoln Exchange days. One of the top waiters at the Lincoln Exchange was Herb Thomas. Herb Thomas is featured in my chapter about the rotisserie, which I will get to here shortly. All right, this is Rubens. Rubens Restaurant. I included Rubens because today it's commonplace to have a chain restaurant in Lincoln, Nebraska. Back then it wasn't, and Rubens was kind of one of the first chain restaurants that really hit the Lincoln scene. They had stores elsewhere around the United States, but they came in, and a lot of people that are my age, I didn't, but I have a lot of friends who worked at that restaurant. So a lot of people had connections. When I mentioned I was writing a book, people go, "Are you doing Rubens?" Because I work there from and such and such. So Rubens was out by Gateway Mall, if you remember, and I have a couple of recipes from Rubens in the book as well. So I mentioned Herb Thomas. This was his boss. This is Bob Sepapor. Bob opened the rotisserie on the corner of 11th and O, and in fact that's the bar that's in there now. It's now Dish Restaurant at 11th and O. Bob opened that and then eventually turned it over to his son Nader, and then Nader ran it. The rotisserie. Bob was novel because he was a little bit ahead of his time. He did some things that people weren't doing at the time. See these big windows there in the background? Restaurants back in the day, they didn't have like these big, because people didn't want to be seen while they were eating their food. That's not how it was done. But Mr. Sepapor thought, I want to have these ones so people can kind of look out and look at it because it's O Street and things are happening. Eventually, he had so many complaints from diners that he had to put curtains on the on the windows. So he ended up curtains. Bob was one of the first people to have an open kitchen. The concept is fairly common now where you'll find it, but he had an open kitchen. His staff back in the day, they all kind of wore bicycle caps. They were known for that because most of the cooks rode bicycles. So you'd walk in and you'd see them back there with their little bicycle hats sitting in. And it's to this day, Dish is still open. When you walk in that front door, you can see the kitchen. You can see the kitchen back there. The restaurant was the second to have outdoor seating. The first, I believe, was Pontillo's. The second was Dish, so they had outdoor seating. Now it's commonplace. Every restaurant has outdoor seating, but back then it didn't. He introduced the restaurant was called Rotisserie, so he was convinced that people were ready for chicken cooked on a rotisserie, that kind of thing. It didn't go over. Yeah, he finally went to steak. Yeah, so yeah, he had so many. So he also got rid of all the booths that were in the restaurant that was that spot that was there previously. And Nader told me when I sat down with Nader, he said that he got rid of all the booths and just replaced everything with tables in there. And so that when they did that, then people would come in and they would say, well, we'd like a booth. And Mr. Sepper said, well, we don't have booths anymore. And the people would turn around and walk out. Yeah, so yeah. So, but he didn't bend there. Yeah, it's like with the steak. Yeah, he said, I'm going to leave it as the tables. And now it's used around Lincoln. It's 50-50 whether you have booth seating or not. And now every restaurant has these great big windows. That's the thing about restaurants today is they have these big windows. They have these concrete floors. They have these high ceilings, and they're all super loud. So. All right, this is Larry Snyder and Earl Vermoss. Larry Snyder and Earl Vermoss. This is the steakhouse. In fact, the steakhouse has been closed for a number of years, but there still is a sign over there on Cornhusker. When you drive by, it still says the steakhouse. I feel bad for people who come to Lincoln. It's a car lot now, and people driving and going, there's a steakhouse over here? I'm surprised they haven't taken that down. The steakhouse ran for over 50 years. It was one of the go-to places for steak. Larry Snyder was kind of a character. He owned Snyder Industries, very successful. So he and Earl ran that restaurant for a number of years, and 50 plus years. And it was known for its decor because they had dead animals all over mostly that these two gentlemen hunted. So they had. And again, they had an open. If you remember, they had a grill right there in the corners. You could see the guy flipping the steaks. And again, like I said, I was looking to spread out, and this was on Cornhusker Highway over there on 33rd and Cornhusker. So this is Larry Price. He's probably one of the most well-known folks we have in the Lincoln restaurant industry. He opened King's Food Host. This is him flipping burgers at a King's. He started by selling his burgers at the state fair back in the 30s, and then opened up a restaurant that developed into one of the early successful fast food chains. And even to this day, there's no more Kings around, but you can still feel his impact or see his impact that he had on the Lincoln dining scene. Amigos right now features. The part of theirs is the King's Drive-In. They have the recipe for the Frenchies and the hamburgers. Parkway Lanes for a number of years. Fred and Ruby Valenta ran the counter there, and Fred cut his teeth cooking burgers at King's, and so the burgers that you got at Parkway Lanes were the same ones. The Pantry was part of the King's family. Howard's Pantry that then later opened on 48th and Normal. Its origins relate to the Kings. So his stretch really reached out far, and it is quite impressive. And I think next to the Tony and Luigi's, I think most people that come up and talk to me, they have a memory about King's. The drive-in that they went, that they met their girlfriend at, or the car that they drove, that kind of thing. All right, this is the original Tony and Luigi's. Yes. First day it opened, Tony and his cousin Luigi, they made $6.
The same location?
Yep, that's the location. This was out on 52nd and O. As I told you, back then it was in the boondocks, and it was a scary part of town. They often would have kerfuffles happen in the parking lot, so police were called out often at the times because, like I said, it was kind of a rough area. And you look at that car, you can see sitting there. That's looks like a 30s from the 30s. Tony and Luigi's opened. They shortly after Tony bought out his partner, Luigi kept the name Tony and Luigi's, and then over the years it just kept expanding as it became more and more popular. They kept expanding. It was an Italian restaurant that just somehow captured the hearts of Lincoln diners. I think part of it, and this is part of the reasons why these restaurants succeeded so long, was because of the people behind them, and in this case it was Tony. Tony was quite the character, and he was there all the time. He was there all the time, dressed to the hilt. He had on his suit, had on his nice shoes, and his hair slicked back, and as his son told me, he had a knack for not forgetting people's names. People would come from out of town. They usually came on Nebraska football weekends, and they would come once or twice a year. with the Kearney or Grand Island or Hastings or even at Scottsbluff, and come in, and he would greet them at the door and call them by their first name, and that really stuck with people, that he'd had such a memory for names like that. And he made a point of going around to every table. I mentioned Arturo's, Carmen and Art, and if you remember, Carmen would always greet you at the door, and she would sit you down, and then a little later on, Art would be working his way around to the tables, and saying hello and talking to everybody. So that was part of it. Bob Logsdon at the Legion Club. I mean, he was the guy, and he went around and made sure you were having a good time, and would ask about your families and that kind of thing. So that's why I think a lot of these restaurants were so successful, was because of the people in it. So that I had to throw that Tony and Luigi slide, because you look at it today, where that spot was. When I sat down with Tony and Mike. And that was my favorite chapter to write, was because when you sit down with two Italian guys and to talk about food, oh my goodness, they're a hoot. So I would just set the tape recorder between them, and I would ask them a question, and they just would go. And they would finish each other's sentences, and they would bring back memories. They were talking about memories. My favorite story was Mike told me a story that he used to give his dad a ride home from the restaurant. He would go to pick up his dad. He came in, and the guy working the podium said, "Yeah, your dad's upstairs talking to Bob Taylor." And he said, "Oh, okay." And he thought Bob Taylor, the weather guy. Remember the Bob Taylor, the weather guy, Channel 10, 11? He's like, "Oh, I'll go up there and go get Dad," and kind of thing. And he walked in. It was Robert Taylor, the actor. Robert Taylor, of course, was from Nebraska. And he was good friends with Tony. Yeah. And so they were sitting there, and Mike was like in awe. And he's like, "What was Robert Taylor?" So he sat down, and he was just listening to Tony and Robert talk back and forth, and he just got a kick out of it. So yeah, a lot of these places, celebrity sightings would happen. If they would come to perform in Lincoln, they usually had a meal at Tony and Luigi's. So it was a hopping place. At this point, I got about 5 minutes left, I guess, so I'll take some questions.
We wondered if the hobnob was in the book.
No, that was on, as I said, that was in the 100. Yeah, when I pared it down, the hobnob is not there, but some people have asked me if I'm going to do a volume 2. If I get up enough gumption, yeah, the hobnob definitely will be in volume 2. The last time I was here, the folks who had Johnson's Cafe, which was a truck stop, they were here, and that's one I would like to focus on. The Lone Oak would be a good one, a steakhouse that was popular on the outskirts of Lincoln. So yes.
Did you cover the boar's head?
She asked if I covered the boar's head. No, that was on the list. That was on the list as well too. If they had given me more than 6 months to write the book, some of these restaurants would end up. Here's an example. Do you remember the East Hills Supper Club? Yes. Yeah, that was out on 70th Street. I wanted to include that in the restaurant and supper club section, but when I started doing my research, I just could not find a lot of information on it, and it was very frustrating, and I felt like I was spinning my wheels on that when I could have been devoting that to another restaurant. But that's where I wish I would have had more time, because then I could have been able to dig into it and find that kind of thing. So I'm down to 2 minutes, folks.
And
So.
the grid, too.
And the what?
Grid.
The grid. I'm not familiar with the grid, so.
Across from the Rococo.
Oh, right across from Rococo. Yeah. My dad read the book, and and of course, my dad being as dads do. So you forgot one. Okay, Dad, which one? And the one he mentioned was Foster's Cafe, which was over on Cornhusker as well, about 27th and Cornhusker. I did mention Foster's in one of the chapters, the drumstick chapter. I wrote there's a chapter about the drumstick, and the owner of the drumstick, who opened the drumstick, he worked at Foster's. So yeah, so there is a mention, and I told my dad there is a mention. So yeah.
You didn't mention Lebsax, did you?
Yeah, and Lebsax is in there. Yeah, so as I mentioned, there are 32 restaurants in here. Lebsack's was a cafe that was known for the brothers that ran it, and they were characters. Oh my goodness, they were characters. And one of the brothers had crackers in his apron, and he would just throw it to you after you ordered your chili. You know, he'd throw the crackers out of his So there are some, very popular. I'll mention where you can get the book. You can get the book right here in the gift shop. Right here, it's available here. It's also available in all the bookstores, like Barnes and Noble and Francie and Finch. And all right, folks, thank you. Thanks for coming out today.